Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. Our show topic today is early insults, effects of chemical, metal, and waterborne contaminants on the developing brain. Our guest is Dr. David Bellinger. He is a professor of neurology and psychology at Harvard University Medical School and a senior research associate in neurology at Boston Children's Hospital. He holds a PhD in psychology from Cornell University and a master's degree in epidemiology from Harvard School of Public Health. He holds a secondary appointment as professor in the Department of Environmental Health at Harvard School of Public Health and is currently the president of the International Society for Children's Health and the Environment. Let's welcome Dr. David Bellinger. Welcome, Dr. Bellinger.
Thank you very much, Mary Kay. A pleasure to be here.
Our topic today is early insults in the brain in child's development. And what is your opinion is the major insult to the developing brain in today's world?
Well, based on current information, I would say that it's an old exposure, lead, which has been around for many thousands of years. Humans have been very creative in thinking of ways to make use of its many useful properties. But unfortunately, those uses have resulted in the dispersion of large amounts of lead into the human environment. And wonderful steps have been taken in the last several decades to reduce population exposures to lead, taking lead out of gasoline, out of residential paint, out of piping and solder. But unfortunately, the decades of use of lead in those ways has led to tremendous reservoirs of lead that are legacies of that long prior use. And children are still being exposed to lead, unfortunately. And at the same time that we've been having these public health successes in driving down lead exposures, we've been learning that no level of lead is safe for children.
Yeah, the old adage was there was a safe level, but you're telling me that your research has showed otherwise, pretty much.
That's right, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control explicitly acknowledged that in 2012 when they could not set a health-based action level because they said there is no level that's safe. So efforts should be directed towards reducing exposures so that blood lead levels are as close to zero as possible.
Now let's fast forward a bit to Flint, Michigan and Ranger, Texas. They have what has been reported the highest lead levels in the nation that has been reported. Were you involved with anything that was going on in Flint, Michigan?
Only as an observer. I was asked by the New England Journal of Medicine to write a commentary on the episode of water contamination with lead, so I did some background research and spoke to some of the individuals who were involved in that really unfortunate episode. It really is an egregious case of public health malpractice whereby decisions were made based on simply the bottom line to save Flint some money without consideration of what the public health consequences might be. So when they started taking water from the Flint River instead of from Lake Huron, as they had been for years and years, that water, for number one, was not as clean as the Lake Huron water. It was much more acidic and corrosive. But also, for a reason that no one has been able to identify, standard protocols that are used to improve the quality of water were stopped. They were no longer adding chemicals to the water that would prevent or reduce the corrosion or corrosivity of the water. So that those two factors combined to create a situation where the water started eating away at the pipes and coming in contact with lead. In many cases, much of the piping was still made of lead rather than copper or PVC. And so lead started leaching out of the pipes and gradually increased in the drinking water that was delivered into the homes.
So what's being done about this problem?
Well, they've switched back to the Lake Huron water, for one thing, but a tremendous amount of damage was done to the water infrastructure. And so for the last 2 years, going on 3 years now, many of the citizens have been drinking bottled water and using bottled water to bathe their children, to brush their teeth.
But what happens, though, to the children who are already exposed? We know the exposure happened, we know it was bad, we know it was wrong, but what is going to happen to these children who were exposed?
Well, the research suggests that any intellectual deficits and behavioral deficits that are caused by the lead are persistent. They can be measured for years into the future. Now, we don't know whether there are steps that can be taken to reduce the likelihood or the severity of deficits and their expression in later years. There is some animal evidence that suggests that if you provide lead-exposed animals with an enriched environment, meaning a more interesting, more stimulating environment, that the behavioral and neurochemical impacts of the lead can be reduced. Surprisingly, given how long we've studied lead, we still don't know whether that's the case, whether those interventions would reduce the morbidities associated with lead in children. There's good reason to think that they would, and in fact many of those programs are being implemented in Flint just on the assumption that they're good for children and will improve their long-term outcomes.
Are there any chelating agents that can be used on these children to remove these heavy metals from their body?
There are, but unfortunately they are known not to reverse the cognitive damage of lead. There was a very large study that involved more than 700 children who had blood lead levels greater than 20 micrograms per deciliter, which is about 20 times the level that's average for U.S. children. So these were children who were very highly exposed. And the children were randomized to receive a chelating agent, the most commonly used agent, Succimer, and then there was a placebo group, and the children in the two groups were followed for several years, and there was no difference in their cognitive outcomes. So chelating agents are not the solution for the broader problem that we're facing. And pediatricians will not generally chelate a child until a blood lead exceeds 45 micrograms per deciliter, which is very, very high by today's standards. So the agents are not an option for most lead-exposed children of today.
So besides obviously not having lead in the environment, it seems it's been pernicious for a number of years, and now with the cost-cutting measures that were instituted in Flint, now we pretty much have an epidemic of children who are going to be cognitively impaired, which again, will fall upon the social system perhaps to help them throughout the remaining of their lives. The question becomes, the cost-benefit analysis obviously was a poor choice by the municipality. The lives have been ruined. Do you hold any hope, though, that perhaps future research may find a way to reverse some of these cognitive deficits?
Yes, that's an active area of research, and we're optimistic. Although there are no magic bullets, I think, out there, hopefully there will be some options that are identified that will be useful. There have been cost-benefit analyses, and it's been shown quite dramatically that spending a few dollars up front to prevent exposure yields tremendous benefits, not only human benefits of better outcomes, life outcomes for the children, but reduced cost for medical care, special education needs, and so on. In fact, the cost-benefit analysis shows that the benefits of preventing lead exposure are similar in magnitude to those of giving childhood vaccines for communicable diseases.
Now, what about the EPA? We've had a lot of controversy, I should say, these days, with a lot of programs being either cut or altered. Are you concerned where this may be going?
Very concerned. The first 6 months of this administration don't give much cause for optimism that the momentum that we've developed over recent decades will be continued. There's a much greater emphasis being placed on streamlining permitting processes, reducing regulations, not just for childhood chemicals, but for many environmental threats.
Yeah, pollutants and waterborne contaminants.
That's right. In the final year of the Obama administration, the Frank-Lautenberg law was passed that reformed the Toxic Substances and Control Act that was initially passed about 30, 40 years ago. And it governs the way that the hazards associated with chemicals are evaluated and chemicals are prioritized. And it took a very important step in that it reversed the way that we have been going about historically this process. Is we allow industries to introduce chemicals into their commercial processes and products, and then we wait to see whether or not some health problem results because of exposure of the population, which has things backwards.
Europe is different.
Europe is different.
Does it the other way around, which I think is more advantageous.
Yes, it's called the REACH program. And that principle, which is much more precautionary, was incorporated into the Lautenberg law so that industries would, before they could introduce a new chemical into the marketplace, they would have to provide some measure of reassurance. It can't be absolute, but some evidence that the product is safe, so that we could avoid all the problems we've had with chemicals such as lead, bisphenol, and phthalates, and the whole host of other chemicals that we're concerned about in terms of their impact on children and everybody in the population.
Yeah, I've noticed you've done research on BPA, the effects of that, organophosphates, pesticides. What do you think of the two? What do you think may be the most threatening between the BPAs, the phthalates, and the organophosphates, or are they equally problematic?
Well, we don't have equal amounts of data on all classes of chemical. In my reading of the literature, I'm most concerned about organophosphate pesticides because they are used in such large quantities on a product that we all consume every day, fruits and produce, and they even get into meats to some degree. And I've done some analyses where I've tried to estimate the impact of different chemical exposures on the general population in terms of how many IQ points lost can we attribute to each chemical or class of chemicals. And lead comes out ahead for any chemical that we have the data to carry out this computation for, but organophosphate pesticides are right behind, and both account for far more IQ points lost on a population basis than brain tumors, traumatic brain injury, congenital heart disease, a lot of other very common and serious pediatric conditions and events. But
that is stunning. That is absolutely stunning.
But the reason is that brain tumors, fortunately, are quite rare, and congenital heart disease, very complex forms of congenital heart disease, are quite rare. So that for an individual child afflicted with these conditions, the impact is large, but because of the rarity of those conditions, the impact on the population distribution of IQ is relatively modest. But with things like lead and organophosphate pesticides, everyone is exposed virtually. It's hard to find someone you can't detect lead or pesticides in their blood. And so everyone, and again, because there may not be a threshold for adverse effect, everyone is harmed to some extent, some more more than others, but everybody's contributing to the population IQ loss.
I know in reading some of the literature myself, I've noticed that Europe has put some bans on some of the organophosphates, such as, the glyphosates and the dicambas. But I'm fearful that this new administration, with the laissez-faire attitude of let industry do what they want, backing off some of these regulations, which were put in place to protect people. People have the assumption that regulation is bad. I don't know where they got this idea. But without regulation, we'd have foodborne illness that would be rampant through our country. We'd have all kinds of disease. I just don't think that the majority of the people understand the importance of regulation. Not all regulation is good, don't get me wrong, but they're there as a framework so that we don't get ourselves into trouble as a population.
Back in 1970s, the Cuyahoga River flowing through Cleveland caught on fire because of all the petroleum-based pollutants that were in the river. And in the same period in Los Angeles, the concentration of airborne lead was over 70 micrograms per cubic meter. Today it's about 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter, and the Cuyahoga River isn't catching on fire anymore. Those were clearly environmental disasters that we were right before our eyes, and we no longer have to worry about those things. But your point is very well taken. The Trump administration has already proposed to reverse the Obama administration ban on the organophosphate pesticide chlorpyrifos, which is was used in very large quantities, and so we may see that reintroduced into the marketplace as a pesticide. What
can people do to protect themselves? Because it appears that this administration, coal ash is okay to be put into the rivers. It's okay climate change isn't real. It's a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. We all know that now the Chinese are taking bull by the horn, and they're going to be working towards climate change goals. But what do you tell to the people in this country that are being hurt, the children being harmed? What kind of guidance can you give these type of issues?
Well, this is really a time for getting out of the chair and being quite active in contacting your representatives, lobbying them to let them know that this is an issue, that it's very important, and it's that you want them to support specific legislation that will prevent the rollback of some of these regulations.
I know that you've done some work with Dr. Grandjean on human health effects of developmental exposure to chemicals, something called the Farrow Statement.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the Farrow's statement issued from a meeting that was held, I believe it was 2006, in the Faroe Islands in the North Atlantic. And it was focused on the developmental origins of adult diseases, because the thinking now is that many adult diseases don't start because of events that occur in adulthood, but they are the legacy of early environmental exposures, even prenatal exposures. And so this is a meeting that is actually held every 2 to 3 years. The most recent one was last year in Kitakyushu in Japan. And it's focused on trying to understand how we can, by going back and preventing exposures of the fetus and young child, that we can perhaps reduce the morbidity associated with these adult diseases such as obesity and metabolic syndrome.
And these, according to research, do these actually start in the fetus or once they're born? What has research showed?
Both. It depends upon the particular target of a toxicant, neurotoxicant, or metabolic toxicant. There are different critical windows of vulnerability for different health outcomes, which underlies the idea that the impact of exposure to a chemical might differ depending upon whether it occurs during fetal life or later in life. And they both might be bad, but the effects may be expressed in different ways.
For example, cigarette smoking by the mother during pregnancy. Low birth weight?
Low birth weight, about 200 to 300 grams, yeah, for a pack a day, a smoker.
Any cognitive deficits in the child?
The child will be at increased risk. It may not, it's hard to say for any individual child what the impact will be, but on average, if we look at cross groups, one group where the mothers smoked during pregnancy and another group where the mothers didn't smoke during pregnancy, the children in the group of the mothers who smoked will be at higher risk of having some cognitive deficit.
And asthma, potentially, in the child, potentially, with secondhand smoke even
Absolutely.
ongoing.
Yeah.
Now, we already said that lead is one of the most pernicious. Do you find in any of your studies and in any of the Pharaoh analyses that took place that the lead crossed the placenta, and where was it more harmful to the child, during development or once they were born?
Lead does cross the placenta very freely. So whatever the mother is exposed to, the fetus is exposed to. Methylmercury, the concentration in the fetus is actually about 70% higher than in the mother.
Oh.
It's transported across the placenta, which is really quite a worrisome
that is very
characteristic.
worrisome.
And we know that the fetus is much more sensitive to methylmercury than is a child or an adult, because it disrupts some brain processes that are very fundamental to the development of the brain. It interferes with the way that newborn cells in the brain, they're born in certain areas, and then they migrate out to where they are supposed to be. And methylmercury interferes with the chemical signaling that guides that migration process. So the brain ends up looking quite different than it should had it developed in the absence of methylmercury.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, is methylmercury what is found in fish?
That's right.
And that's the most toxic, or not?
There's controversy about that, but it is certainly quite toxic. Yes.
And what about, can that be chelated out of the child? I know you said lead was a problem.
Mercury can be chelated, but the same problems arise. The chelators are very nonspecific. They are not tuned specifically for lead or for mercury, but they'll also chelate essential chemicals that look like lead or mercury, like calcium.
Something that's needed for the body.
Something that's needed. So these chelating agents are quite dangerous, and they should be administered only by centers that have a lot of expertise, because there have been cases where children have died because they've been given the wrong chelating form of a chelating agent. And even with something like lead, where that's the chemical for which we have the most experience with chelating agents, they do promote the excretion. They bind to the lead in the body and promote its excretion. But it doesn't tend to pull out too much lead at the low levels of exposure, and that's why it's only indicated for children with blood lead levels above 45 microgram per deciliter, because that's where the risk-benefit balance comes out to be in favor of chelation.
Now, getting back to this Pharaoh statement, is there anything remarkable that you'd like to share that came out of that meeting?
Well, the statement, and a different statement comes out of each meeting of this group concerned with the developmental origins of adult disease. And to be honest, they're all fairly similar in that they're trying to raise the profile of this issue that we have to be concerned right from the time of conception, and in some cases even prior to conception.
You're telling women in this country don't eat the, fish that are bottom feeders. When we're told.
Well, fish, it's a large predatory, long-lived fish. So it's basically fish that eat other fish. So the fish that pregnant women, women who want to get pregnant, and children are discouraged from eating are shark, tilefish from the Gulf of Mexico, and swordfish, and king mackerel. Those are the fish with the highest concentration. Tuna is very commonly consumed, and it's a little tricky because tuna steaks have a lot more mercury in them than canned tuna.
Really?
Yeah, because it's a different species of tuna.
I see.
Some tuna are bigger than others and more predatory.
And I guess the million-dollar question is, well, how did the fish get all the mercury?
Well, yeah, they weren't born with it. It's the result of pollution from primarily fossil fuel fired power plants.
And coal?
Yeah, coal. Yeah, petroleum. And it gets the mercury is discharged into the atmosphere, not in the form of methylmercury, but it's metallic mercury, inorganic mercury, and it settles into water bodies, and then it settles into sediments, and it's methylated by bacteria in the sediments, and then it starts working its way up the food chain. So the little fish are eaten by the bigger fish, and those fish are eaten by the bigger fish, and we eat the big fish. We're at the top of that food chain. So mercury bioaccumulates as it ascends the aquatic food chain. So that's why it's a problem for us.
So that's why having regulations in place is very important for our survival, not just the planet, but for human survival.
Absolutely, it's health is not as optimal if someone has a lot of chemicals on board, and the EPA has been trying to regulate fossil fuel fired coal power plants for many years. They went through about a 20-year process getting new regulations in place, and every step of the way industry files lawsuits to try to get a rollback. And
Scott Pruitt, who was one of who filed the most, and he's now the head of the EPA. We live in very, very questionable times, and I don't know where this is all going, but I think people need to get active, as you said, become activists, and work towards the common good.
It's not a time to sit back.
Certainly not. Well, thank you for being here, Dr. Bellinger. I appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure, Mary Kay. Thank you.
And hopefully the people at home will learn something new about mercury and all the contaminants in our environment. Thank you so much. I want to thank our guest, Dr. David Bellinger, for sharing his insights and opinions on the issues of contaminants in our environment and effects on human health. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guests, visit The Legal Edition online at thelegaledition.com. As always, this information is for general educational purposes only. It is not to be construed or relied upon as legal, medical, or professional advice. Please consult a qualified practitioner as to your legal, medical, or professional needs. And don't forget, subscribe online, follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter.